Hey everybody, welcome to the Gears of Defiance Q&A live stream. I will be answering some questions and talking about my new Kickstarter for Gears of Defiance here in just a minute. All right. Well, my project has officially launched, so I'm here to kind of celebrate that event and to answer a few questions and to talk about the game. So, for those who aren't aware, the game is called Gears of Defiance. This is a role playing game set in a steampunk style universe. There is not one inherent setting to the game. However, I have included one setting that I wrote, and we are going to be including settings written by some really great designers. If you take a look at the Kickstarter page, you'll see that we've announced the first two of those settings, which are going to be written by Senfung Lim and Stephanie Bryant. I'm really thrilled to have this kind of talent coming on board the project. I've been a fan of both of their work for quite some time. So the project is live. We've already got some backers coming in, which is really exciting. Um, and I'm going to share that project around a little bit. So just bear with me for a second here. Muted. All right, I am back in, ready to answer some questions. If anybody wants to get in the chat, go ahead and ask away. Otherwise, I have some questions that have been asked already that people would like for me to cover. So, I guess I'm going to get started and jump in. I had a question here from Brad Skaggs who asks, what makes your system special? Well, that is a really great question and probably a question that everybody is going to want to know the answer to. I think it's not about having a special system or the best system. It's about having the system for the story that you want to tell or the stories you want to enable the players at the table to tell. That being said, I went through a lot of iterations of the system. I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. But really, I borrowed a lot from different systems that I love. I tried this game in Apocalypse World, which is actually how this game started. Was based. It was originally going to be Apocalypse World game. All the playbooks were the different archetypes that did make it to the final version. It just didn't quite work. So I went to my next system, which is a system I'm a huge fan of, called Fate Accelerated. And this system, I think it takes everything that's great about Fate and, in my opinion, makes it better, or at least better for the kind of game I like to play. It's fast paced action, there's a lot of drama, and I really, really liked their approach system. At the same time, I really like dice pools. I love, you know, gathering together all your dice and rolling out a huge dice pool. And I've played a couple great games that use mechanics like that, including World of Dew, which is based on House of the Blooded. And World of Dew was written by Ben Warner, who is just a fantastic designer, adapted from House of the Blooded, which is by John Wick, who is also a fantastic designer. So I guess that's a good place to start. I loved what they did with the dice. Now, I don't use the dice in the same way. Again, it's all about telling a story that fits the system I wanted to use. So, what sets my game apart from most others, I don't think is in the mechanics. It is in the way the story is told, and the mechanics really support telling that story. The approach system that I'm using here gives you several ways to approach a conflict. It's not about fighting your way through every obstacle that comes in your path. You're going to want to think smart. You're going to want to rely on other players. You're going to want to scheme and plan, and ultimately maybe use an approach that isn't combat based, right? The game is about resistance and revolution, which are powerful topics that I think generally people associate with violent uprisings. However, they're not always violent uprisings. In fact, change can come from within through democracy, peaceful protests like the civil rights movement. And so I wanted to design a system that made a civil rights movement peaceful protest just as exciting mechanically as a all-out guns blazing gunfight. And I think I managed to do that because the mechanics for these things are the same. It's not like D&D where, which I love D&D, don't get me wrong, but that's more of a success past system where I've kind of adopted more of the apocalypse world or fate mentality of a range of success options, including failing forward, which I think is a concept that I love in role-playing games. The idea that you can fail at something, but it still moves the drama forward. And in a game like Gears of Defiance, where you are second-class citizens struggling against this oppressive empire, failure is not only optional, it's inevitable. You're going to fail at certain times, but that is going to push the drama forward. If you look at some of the inspirations I took, like Les Miserables and A Tale of Two Cities, there is a great amount of failure in those stories. Even in something like Star Wars, or if you look at the newest Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, you see failure around every corner. And so that is something I wanted to capture in this game design. You're not the best of the best here. You are scavenging your supplies. You're stealing what you don't have. You're trying to make something basically out of nothing. And in doing so, I needed mechanics that really supported that idea. And so the basic mechanics are tied into the entire game, from world creation, character creation, all the way through actually obviously playing the game, which is something I'm really excited for people to get out there and play. And if people do have questions about mechanics or want to see the game kind of in more detail, every backer is going to get a preview link to our quick start rules that we released at Gen Con last year. That was pretty successful. I got a lot of really great feedback. Obviously, that's not the final version of the rules, as we've play tested the game and things have changed since that came out. And also, there's everything in there is expanded greatly from what you have in the original rule set. So if you're gonna back it, check that out. So, all right. Well, thanks for the question, Brad. Let me go on to the next question. Let's see. Sen Fung Lim, who I talked about briefly, who is actually one of the writers for the project, asks, what is the mechanical hook? What's the emotional experience that's created? I talked about that a little bit when I was talking about the system just a minute ago, but I'll go ahead and address that in a little further detail. The mechanical hook, obviously the basic mechanic is going to be doing dice pools, which, you basically build a dice pool, roll the dice, you try to get a number of successes, right? That's the mechanical hook, basically. However, the emotional experience and the emotional hook is much different because it's what happens when you fail those roles, especially when you have people relying on you. And the goal of the GM in this game is to put the players into tough positions where they have to make tough choices. And again, if anybody out there is familiar with Apocalypse World or has played Apocalypse World at all, you'll understand kind of what I'm talking about when I say that you have to make hard decisions, right? The GM is going to use these hard moves and put pressure on you. And in Gears of Defiance, everyone at the table plays members of the same family. And so what you do during character creation is you build these bonds between, father, son, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, or even, the pastor of my church, or the guy that runs the soup kitchen where we have to go eat because we have no money. Family is more than just blood. It's also just the bonds that you create during this character creation process. And the goal of the GM is to put stress on these bonds. For example, your brother, who's reckless, turns your peaceful protest into a violent one. You know that he's responsible, and you don't agree with the decision he made. In fact, you might be very angry at him. People probably died. People that you knew probably died because of your brother's actions, but yet he's still your brother. And what do you do in that situation? Do you turn him into the Empire? Do you basically excommunicate him from your life? Or does family come first, and even though you disagree with him, you're going to try to change him, bring him alongside your point of view, or even just protect him from the Empire when the Empire comes to your door? And I think that is the emotional experience that we're looking for in this game, is that players are going to have to make these decisions. They're going to build relationships with NPCs, and they're going to have to use those relationships at points in the game. You have your soldiers, you have your imperial citizens. All these people are living in this world that is vibrant and basically alive. And so the way that the players interact with these NPCs, what happens when you go to an NPC that you've grown to trust over a campaign, when you go to them for help, they help you, and next thing you know, you find them being executed in the public square, right? That's on your character. And how does your character deal with that, right? And so we have something called the alignment matrix, which the alignment matrix kind of tracks your character's progress as they're moving from like peaceful, which like more traditional, to more radical, and also as they move from liberty up to authority themselves, right? This game is kind of a study in radicalization through a steampunk fantasy lens. And I think you'll find that your characters drift in a certain way without you really realizing it or planning it, or maybe even wanting your characters to end up there. So potentially, you could end up being seen as a terrorist by the same people you're trying to help, because you've done some terrible things in your quest for glory or for freedom. Let's see, Board Games with Panda, which has a great podcast. If you're not familiar with Board Games with Panda, you should check them out. They ask, where would you fall into the authority, liberty, and traditional radical matrix if you designed a character based on yourself? To be honest, I'd probably be a little more towards the authority side. Not because I believe that an authority, or that the current authority needs to stand, but I do believe that having an authority that takes care of the people. So I would be more of on the traditional authority side, I think, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You'll find monarchies on that side. Now, anything becomes dangerous when it goes to extremes. Even a monarchy can become dangerous when the monarchy abuses that power and they rule with like the absolute right. Like they claim divine right to rule, which is something that you've seen in history with some of these governments and religions. However, I do believe that an authority that is in the best interest of the people, maybe that's probably the character I would play. I feel like as I played, I'd probably change, as anybody would. My character would go through the same twists and turns, I think, that everybody else would. So, thanks for the question, guys. That's great. I'll uh, I'll keep asking or answering some of these questions that people have been asked. Toby Abed asks, "What were the first few embarrassing titles you considered before finding the awesome title that is Gears of Defiance?" Toby, thank you first of all for calling it an awesome title. I worked really hard on that title, in that I didn't have a title for a very long time. In fact, for the first year of this project's life, it was just an untitled steampunk resistance game. I remember the first person I ever spoke to about this game was Brendan Conway, who's a friend of mine, also a game designer. And we I had no idea what it would turn into at that point, and I literally had no name. I just knew after our conversation that I went home, I felt inspired, and I just started writing down what was at that time a Powered by the Apocalypse game. So I started shooting out some ideas like, oh well, Revolution World or like Steampunk World, but I didn't like it. Like those titles all fell flat, so I just said, forget it. I'm not going to worry about naming it right now. And I was at a convention the next year with a buddy of mine, Aloy Lasanta. And Aloy from Third Eye Games, if you're familiar with Mermaid Adventure, that's his game, Ninja Crusade as well. I was driving him to the airport after a convention, and we had some time to kill, and we were just talking about names, right? And I said, something about I kind of like the idea of Defiance being in the title. And Aloy was just quick on the uptake, and he was, he shouted out the name. He was like, "What about Gears of Defiance?" And he was kind of just had this flow to it, and I really liked that name. He kind of liked the idea that the initials spell out God, which is an authority figure of its own right, and that kind of the game is not meant to be a religious take it all, but that kind of does play into the idea of authority. And, we spent the rest of the car ride talking about, does that fit? Can we come up with a better name? And we really couldn't. And it started as a working title. I said, okay, I'll call this Gears of Defiance. And we'll see what people think about it. There's been some people that haven't loved the title, I'll be honest, but I think more people have. I've gotten a lot more positive feedback about the title than not. And it kind of is, and based on a quote from Mario Savio, that I have in the book, which talks about, it says, "There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." And I love that quote. I think that fits in exactly with what we're trying to tell in our game, right? So, a little off topic from the question, but that is where the title kind of came from, and that is the title we ended up with. So, Toby, thank you so much for your question. Let me see. I'll take a couple other questions here. I got some more time for sure. Looks like we have another question from Board Games with Panda. You said that family is a big factor in the game. When we create our characters, are we part of the same family or different families? Well, the core concept of the game is that you're part of the same family. But what that looks like is completely up to you. I said it earlier, a family is not necessarily your blood. A family is the people that you choose to call family. And so when you're deciding to make your characters, you could be from multiple families. You could make two families that maybe they're forced to live together, right? Maybe resources are tight, space is tight, and you have to live together in a cramped little apartment in a slum somewhere. And while you might not be blood related, you've become a family. One of the settings that I'm excited to talk about, which again, these settings will show up in the updates, you'll be able to read more about them. But the first setting we're going to unlock, as long as we get to that goal, is by Senfung Lim, and it is about orphans kind of living on the streets. And the authority of the Empire takes the form of the constables that are kind of chasing you down, and all you're trying to do is feed your family, maybe feed your brothers and sisters, and so you've got this group of orphans that aren't necessarily blood related, but have formed that tight bond. It makes me think of the movie Newsies, if anyone is familiar with that, where these kids they band together and they become a tight family unit. So the game is designed to be a family. Again, what that looks like is going to be different based on everyone. And thanks again for the question, Board Games with Panda. You guys are great. Let's see here. Let me tackle this one from Doug Lewandowski. Doug asks, during the design iteration, was there an element you really liked but that didn't quite fit? To be honest, there were many. I struggled with a lot of different concepts. Like I said earlier, first, the game started being in Apocalypse World. And the reason I wanted an Apocalypse World is, first of all, I love the system. I love the stories you can tell with the system. But I like the level of narrative control it gives to players. I like the way you can just grab a playbook and jump into a game. And I like the way that the GM is reactionary and puts pressure on you to make moves. And when you fail, bad things happen to you, but you can fail forward. And so I really wanted those concepts in my game. And so I thought, well, the best way to do that is to make it Apocalypse World. What I ended up doing was ditching the Apocalypse World and trying to keep those concepts. So it didn't end up working, but I did end up making it into something that I think covered all the bases. Now, one thing I really wanted to have in the game that I think made it too complicated was the way I handled locations. Locations exist in the game, and they are physical buildings or areas on a map that will grant bonuses either to the family or to the Empire. Basically, the family can spend their season plotting and planning to maybe take down one of these buildings or somehow infiltrate this building, take it over, and repurpose it for use for the revolution. And these buildings give different bonuses based on who controls it during the season phase at the end of a session, or 2 sessions, however long the game goes. You can use these buildings to increase your own like finances, or increase your army, or gain more followers, or basically how every building has a unique purpose. And what I originally set was almost like a mini game. It actually, I've actually taken aspects of that and put them aside and thought, well, maybe this could be a board game someday, because it was nearing a board game level of complexity. You were putting tokens down on a board or on the map that had squares for where the buildings were, and staking control, and there was bidding mechanisms that happened between the GM and the players. And I think it was really a cool system, but it felt really clunky when you put that into an RPG. I might release an optional rule set in the future to add that in, but as of right now, the way that locations are fortified and taking control has changed dramatically since then. I do kind of miss it, but at the same time, I think the game is better off now being a little more streamlined and a little faster, with the focus being on the action phase, which is where your players will actually go do the actions. But that being said, this game has gone through so many iterations that so many different mechanics have come and gone and been added over the years I've been playtesting this game. So thanks for the question, Doug. I think that's awesome. Let's see. We got a question here from Caitlin Collins. Says, I apologize if this was asked earlier, but since there's a focus on Rebellion Revolution, what events have you been inspired by in this game? I kind of talked about a little bit earlier my pop culture references, obviously, like Les Mis, Tale of Two Cities. I'm a big fan of the anime The Last Exile, which is kind of where the art and steampunk aesthetic for this game came from. But as far as real world events, yeah, I did a lot of research into this when coming up with the different methods of control that the Empire can use to control its citizens. I looked back at famous revolutions across the globe, and there have been many. When you look at, obviously, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, but there have been many others. I mean, recently in Egypt, in Greece, in India, even here in America with the civil rights movement and the suffrage movement, gaining women the right to vote and minorities the right to vote. And so I looked at all these. I didn't want it to be Star Wars, right? Star Wars is about an oppressive empire that comes in with their big ships and their big armies and drops stormtroopers onto a planet and takes it over by force, right? And that is, I think, when people think of an evil empire, obviously the Empire from Star Wars is one of the first things that comes to mind. And there's like the Fire Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Very similar. They rule through fear and through military strength. But there have been authorities that rule through other means all throughout history. When you look at the United States, democracy, that's still an authority figure, right? And that system hasn't always benefited everyone equally. Even today, we still have people that we would consider second-class citizens living in the country, right? So I'm not trying to replicate any kind of exact political situation, but rather give people the tools that they can tell these stories. So yeah, you can tell the Star Wars story with the Gears of Defiance rules. You could tell Les Mis. You could tell Tale of Two Cities. But you can also tell, the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King. You can tell that story. You can tell a story through peaceful protests. During one of the play tests we did at Metatopia, which is a game design convention that, first of all, shameless plug, that convention is the best. You should go to it. But one of the groups, it was a purely bureaucratic government. And so they infiltrated the bureaucracy, and they were trying to make the bureaucracy work for them by basically getting support and things like that from within the empire. And so there was not really, there was no violence in that entire session, but everybody had a really great time, and we really got to tell that story. So thanks a lot for the question, Caitlin. I appreciate you tuning in. Let's go to another question here. From Jose Fichette has asked, what do other systems lack that made you create your own? Which I did answer that a little bit earlier. But he also asks, was it hard to match rules to the setting's flavor? And that is, yes, that was difficult, especially when you're talking about a game like this, when the themes are oppression and resistance and revolution. How do you tie mechanics to that? How do you turn radicalization into a mechanic in a role-playing game? That was something I struggled with immensely. I looked at political charts as far as like political alignment and things like that. Nothing really felt right as far as that, as far as those went. So I kind of made our own, right? Like I worked with a couple people I know that were very politically knowledgeable people. My buddy Jason, especially, worked with me on this extensively, just trying to nail out exactly what this alignment matrix would look like. It's not a perfect representation of the journey from traditional to radical, or from populist to tyrant, but it abstracts the process, right? And that was the hardest part, was figuring out what moves, like what abilities will be unlocked based on your position on this alignment matrix, right? What makes a populist different from a reformer or an anarchist or even a rebel? So that was a difficult and time-consuming process. I probably spent several months just working on this alignment matrix, and I'm really happy with the way it ended up. I think that it offers a good way to track your character and how they're progressing, and it also ties in to advancing your character. There's not a level up system. There's not XP like in a traditional D&D style role playing game, but rather your advancement is tied into moving on this track. So you want to move on this track. Even if you as a player are like, oh, I don't want my character to become whatever, or moving on the track gets you advancement and it keeps the game going forward, right? Because a game where your characters stay right where they are is not an interesting one. You want a game where characters have arcs that go over a campaign. And which, while I'm mentioning that, I will talk about the fact that the game is designed for several styles of play. So there is the one shot that you can just gather together with some pre-made stuff and sit down and play for 4 hours or 6 hours or however long. I do that when I go to conventions. I just bring a pre-made characters, pre-made whatever, and we sit down and we play. It also we have different size empires, right, that you can create, and our plan is to include different maps for sizes small to large. Basically anything from the scale of a small city to an entire kingdom, right, like the Persian Empire, that you can resist against. And the size of the empire also determines how strongly it holds on to its control. The smaller empires are going to have a few methods of control they use, and the larger empires are going to have many. And the goal of a campaign is to break down these methods of control, destabilize this empire so that you can bring change. Not necessarily so that you can crash and burn the entire thing to the ground, but so that you can step in and rebuild from what was there, right? And that can look like a military coup. It could look like as simple as putting your own candidate forward, starting your own political party, and getting enough votes, fighting against an unjust system to put your candidate in power, and then bringing change from within, right? And, certain empires are going to be more resistant to certain types of change. So it'll be interesting to see how people spread that out. So thank you, Jose, for the question. And again, I will say yes, it was the most difficult part, especially because the game can be played over many different settings. So looks like we have another question here. Randy Ost asks, is there magic? So there is not really magic in the base game. However, when I say that, I mean there is not like a magic system. There are not any archetypes like wizard, sorcerer, mage, which anything that would use magic inherently. However, when you're creating the empire, magic, and it's certainly an option. And this is something I talk about in the base rules too, is that you can use magic, right? Because a system like Gears of Defiance or like Fate Accelerated, you can use whatever tools you want to do when you're approaching a situation, right? And so I guess this is a good chance to break down and really talk about what a scene looks like, and that a GM will set an obstacle in front of you. Say, for example, your character says, I need to get into this library, I need to steal this old book, and I need to spread this information around and make copies of it, right? Maybe that's your goal for the scene. Well, the GM says, okay, well, there's guards in the way. You have to get past these guards. How do you do it? You choose your approach. Are you going to do it, intelligently, with strength, with courage, brashness? Like, what approach are you going to take to get past these guards? Once you and the GM have decided what approach you're going to use, which can either be prescriptive or descriptive, in that you can say to the GM, I want to use an intelligent approach. What do you think that would look like? Or you can say to the GM, here's what I want to do. What approach do you think this would be? And so when it comes to using magic in this system, magic is inherent in all of those things, right? Well, what I want to do is sneak past the guards, okay? So you can do that a couple different ways, and they would all be stealth. So you can say, oh, I'm going to grab a cloak and a disguise. I'm going to put on a hat, some new glasses. I'm going to sneak in. Or you could say, I'm going to cast a spell to change my appearance. I have magic. I'm going to use magic to make myself invisible and sneak past the guards. Okay, well, that's all the same approach. It's just, how do you want to do it, right? It's all about the narrative, and I think that's something that's important in Gears of Defiance. Is the story you're telling is what's important. And so if your story has magic, then your story has magic. If the authority, which we did have this in one of our playtest sessions, was that the authority was magical, and they kept control over the people through the use of magic. They had invisible eyes in the sky looking down at people. They had wards on the streets. And dismantling these magical pieces was what the goal of the campaign was to be. So it can definitely be in there. Any archetype can be kind of added, to magic. Like you could take the explorer, and they could use magic to explore, right? The hunter could use magic to hunt. And what that magic looks like and how that magic works and the limits of that power are up to the table. And that's something that you talk about during the founding session of the game is what level of I think in Shadows of the Century they call it the Gonzo meter. Like what level of crazy do we want to have in our game? Do we want a grounded, rooted, Tale of Two Cities, incredibly realistic game with very little steampunk technology? Or do we want Full Metal Alchemist, The Last Exile, Legend of Korra, where you have these high levels of tech, and other abilities, powers, and things like that too? That's going to be up to you guys at the table, right? We've generally found that people gravitate towards the middle ground. You give them these templates of like a steampunk empire, and they go from there with steampunk stuff. But we've had sentient robots. Even we had a session where one of our players actually played a sentient robot that was discovering its like feelings and love and things like that for the first time, which, there's really no explanation for that within steampunk, but there doesn't need to be because it's all about the story that you're trying to tell. So, Randy says playing the game is magical. Oh, I guess I missed an opportunity there, Randy. But thank you for the question. Again, playing the game is magical. So, thank you for that. Let's see. We got some other questions coming in. There's just a lot of these I've already answered a little bit. So what I'm going to do is talk about something a little different, which is the structure of the campaign. So the way I wanted to roll this campaign out was to offer more settings and also to give us the chance to increase the amount of artwork we have in the game too. I really love the art style we've chosen for this game, and I love the work that Anthony, our primary artist, has been doing for us, and I want more of it, right? So we set our funding goal at 5,000 because that is what we need to get the game out to you guys. Anything beyond that is great, but that is the bare minimum we need to get you a product into your hands. However, I think you're going to want some of these stretch goals. We have some really, really cool settings coming out. I talked briefly about Sen's setting about about the street rats. We have settings coming that are set in an orphanage. We have some that are set underwater. We have some that are set on other planets. Some feature robots. We even had a pitch for dinosaurs, where it's an oppressive like dinosaur empire. So the system has flexibility in that you can tell all of these stories. There's really nothing tying it directly to steampunk. The reason I chose steampunk was, first of all, I'm a huge fan of it. Secondly, I think that is an easy system to tell stories of oppression and rebellion. I think that steampunk is inherently a system about classism, even though in the actual game, classism does not have to be a thing. And I think that's been the thing that people have struggled the most to wrap their heads around, in that not every empire is classist or racist or any of the things that you normally associate with the steampunk setting. And I think in some of these stretch goals, you're going to see people that, there's obviously still going to be some forms of discrimination. We had one great setting where it was based on disability. It was ableism, where even one of the characters was a soldier. One of their top generals that got wounded in the war, lost an arm, and then after that, the Empire had no use for them and just threw them into a slum with all the other people that suffered disabilities, which is tragic. But that's the story they wanted to tell, and they took back, really started to take back. This was a playtest, so we didn't really get to play the full campaign. But every time I've finished running one of these convention sessions, I've just wanted to sit down. I think everybody at the table has told me, man, I just want to keep playing, find out what happens next, which is exactly what I want people to come away from. When you finish a session, it's like, what happens next, right? So you've made the first steps. You've taken over the docks. You've blown up the Empire's shipping vessel. You've destabilized the military by burning down the armory, right? But then what happens next? Everything you do against the Empire is going to come down on you. And I'm really excited for people to be able to just grab some of these settings and to see what they do with them. So, all right, Robert Turk says, is the print version being done via drive-through Lightning Source? No, it is not. We have a printer that we are handling all the printing from. I'm not publishing the game. Alan from Gallant Knight Games is doing all the publishing, but we have a printer lined up. I think we were looking at a couple different options last I checked, and I'm sure it'll still be available via drive-through or Lightning Source if you want that. And I think the PDF for sure will be available there. But no, we're gonna use an actual printer for both the soft cover and the hardcover. Yeah, legit printing. I've used drive-through in the past for some of my work, and it's a great service, but it is best for really small runs, and when print on demand is the best option for you. My last game, Adara Steampunk Renaissance, it wasn't a huge game. It was kind of my first thing right out of the gate a couple years ago before I really had made any kind of name for myself or anything. And I used print on demand for them, and the quality is pretty good, but you just get a way better price, obviously, per unit when you go with a full publisher. So I'm excited to see what Alan's going to do with that. And as far as all the other add-ons and things you can get, which are the hardcover books, the dice, the coins, which we're looking at campaign coins right now to do the print coins. Yes, okay. Alan, just as Alan said, the Kickstarter print run will be offset. So offset is much nicer. I agree, Robert. It's not a problem. Robert says, offset printing is a nicer option. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we're raising money on Kickstarter is to pay for that offset print run. If I had the money to just pay for however many hundreds of books on my own, I would do it, but I don't. So Kickstarter is great for that. And I guess that kind of ties into a question I've been asked a lot, which is why Kickstarter? Well, first of all, because I don't want to put it just on drive-through with no artwork. We did that with the Ashcan version, which I've got actually right here, which everybody will get a PDF version of this. But we did it at very little expense using artwork that we got from the Chamber of Commerce. So all free artwork. And it turned out really nice, but again, there's a limit to what you can do cheaply. So our goal is to provide a high quality, fully illustrated book. And so the only way we're going to be able to do that is through Kickstarter. Jose asked, will it be the perfect print digest size? It'll be 6x9. I'm not sure if that's the perfect print size. I actually don't know what that size means. But right now we're looking at 6x9. So it'll be not much different in size than this book. Except it will be much thicker. There will be a lot more information in there. We're looking at somewhere around 200 to 250 pages right now. However, that is going to increase drastically once we start getting in all the stretch goals. And this book, like I said, just has the very basic information. This has maybe like less than a quarter of the total amount of archetypes and locations and character creation options and things like that. So The final version is going to be much bigger. Um, yes, Jose asks, like, what was in my hand a minute ago? That's why I brought it back out to demonstrate. Yeah, that is the size that the final book will be. So, thank you for that question. And it looks like we're doing fairly good on the Kickstarter so far. I'm excited. People are commenting, so that's great. I'm really glad that you guys came out to watch this video. I will post this to the Kickstarter page once it's finalized through YouTube, which I think could take 24 hours. But I wanted to check and see if anybody had any last minute questions before I go. So, uh, really quick, Robert asks, what is an ash can? And an ash can version. That's something I throw around a lot without really realizing that I don't really ever explain it. An ash can is just what you call like a preview version. I think that the term kind of came around because it was, that's where it would end up. Um, but it's just kind of a chance to get a rule set out to the public, get people looking at it, maybe talking about it, and to give valuable feedback based on what you've released to them, right? Because nothing is as good of feedback as comments from people that care about the game and that have looked at the game. And that's why we're releasing this to all the backers, so that backers have a chance to give their feedback and talk to me about things that they like or don't like. So it doesn't look like anybody has any more questions. So with that being said, I will call you guys to maybe head over to the Kickstarter page, take a look. I'll be posting an update here shortly to talk about our first two stretch goals that hopefully will hit very soon. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you soon. I'll probably do another one of these videos at some point during the campaign. So if you do have more questions, just leave them in comments or send them to me, and I will answer them. So thank you guys, and have a great rest of the afternoon.